Hello and welcome to the fourth lecture in AC 1002. This lecture concerns site analysis. That's methods of understanding the site, and it builds upon information that we've looked at previously in the location lecture and the orientation lecture. So if we're thinking about the previous lectures, we know that where a building is located can significantly affect how it's designed. And the usual method of establishing some of the constraints on a site is by undertaking a site analysis at the start of a project. So why would we do this? Why is it important? Well, in order to design well on a building site, we need to understand the possibilities of that site. So by carrying out site analysis, we can get some early information on the feasibility of a site. So whether it's able to be built on, or whether it's suitable for the purpose that your client wants to build a building for. It can identify physical constraints of the site before you begin design work. So you can perhaps figure out where the best place to put the building is, or the worst place to put the building is. And we can identify what some of the legal constraints of the site might be. And if we do site analysis properly, we can make sure that all the designers, the architects, the engineers, roads designers and such like, can understand all of the problems and all the possibilities of the site prior to putting pen to paper. So what do we do? How do we do site analysis? There's really sort of two methods right at the start of a project, at the early stages, that we would use to understand what the possibilities or limitations of a site are. The first is desk-based research, and that is pretty much exactly as it sounds. That's research that you would do while you're sitting at your desk, in the office, in the warmth. And then there's a walkover survey, where you have to leave the office and go and walk over the site. Now you probably do desk-based research first to establish what information might be available. You're using information that's already there, information from the internet, information from archives, from government agencies, and that can be useful in providing you a kind of picture of the site. The walkover survey does require you to go to the site and to check what you found out in desk-based research is correct, but also to use your eyes and ears and other senses to provide you with some additional information about the site. So if we consider desk-based research first, one of the most useful things that we have at our disposal are aerial photographs. We can get valuable information from aerial photographs about the layout of sites, the proximity of buildings, the size of things, shadows that maybe are appearing. And these are things that are difficult to establish from a drawn map. A map is quite good at telling you where your site is in relation to other things, but it's sometimes very difficult to show specific information on a map, whereas an aerial photograph brings the thing to life and we can actually start to see where roads are and what fields are and what neighbouring buildings do. So aerial photographs are very, very useful. And of course we've got Google Images or Bing, Google Maps or Bing Maps or any number of other websites to be able to provide us with aerial maps. So we're kind of blessed with that information. And alongside that, we can use aerial photographs to sometimes tell us a little bit about the history of a site. And sometimes, especially in times when it's very dry, so this summer 2018, and previous very dry summers have revealed features in the landscape that show how the landscape was used previously, show how the land was used previously. And this can be buildings or settlements or walls or roadways that have historic significance. And we can sometimes, if we're looking for a development site, if there's evidence of archaeology on the site, that can prove costly for development. The archaeological dig that would have to happen would be paid for by the developer and would increase costs, would delay the development of the site. So understanding where there might be valuable archaeological information on a site might indicate that maybe perhaps we look somewhere else for development. So this can impact on the early feasibility of a project. Historic maps are quite good as well, give you sort of good information, and they can tell you about activities that happened in a particular area which perhaps maybe are no longer there, or they can tell you about buildings that have been demolished, and they can give you information which can impact on the design of foundations or whether there's the need for decontamination. A project that I worked on in Glasgow was an extension to a community centre at Sighthill, and historic maps revealed that there had been a bleach factory on the site long before we ever came to look at it. And part of that revelation meant that we had to consider decontamination of the site. And that eventually led to the whole of the topsoil being stripped off and replaced, which was quite costly. But we understood that at the start because we'd done desk-based research to establish that. Old newspapers are another method that you can understand your site or understand the activities that went on in the site. And they can give you information about activities, maybe news of events that happened on the site that are maybe not evident from visual or drawn records. So for instance, a map might have shown the word factory, but the newspaper might show it was a munitions factory, in which case you might have to do some survey work to make sure that there's no dangerous materials or contaminated ground there. But you would only find that out from this historical record. Likewise, mining records are very useful. Most developed countries have at one point or another mined for coal, ores, metals, precious stones, and sometimes those areas that have been mined have then later been developed or been amalgamated into cities. The mining records round about Glasgow and Edinburgh show quite extensive mining. South side of Glasgow was a very heavily mined area, and it's not uncommon for areas that have mines to later experience the ground collapsing as the material in the mines gets washed away, and this can cause sinkholes, and in extreme cases, whole buildings sinking into the ground. So understanding from a mining record whether there's any danger can help you design your foundations or potentially help you design the location of your site or location of the buildings over the whole site. Or indeed could tell you that the whole site is not the best site to use. And we also have, in recent years, a kind of fantastic resource in Street View. And this kind of allows you to sit at your desk and virtually drive down streets and look at buildings. And most of the time, Google Street View has a number of years available to it. So you can look at 2017, you can go back to 2012, and you can see changes, and you can see buildings that have appeared. And it's a very good resource. Sometimes when I get a project into the office, while I'm on the phone to the client and they're telling me their address, I will go on to Street View to see what the building is, so that I can have a very quickly get an informed conversation about the building. So Street View is a great thing, and it prepares you for information that you might be able to then check on a walkover site. The other benefit is that sometimes you cannot get far enough away from a building to see all the aspects of it. Or the day you go to site, it might be obscured, or there might be something in the way. So having a record from Google Street View is a fantastic resource, and it's really a thing that you can use to look at all the details of a building and take a record at a particular time. So once you've done your desk-based research, you have to go to site. You have to understand it. You have to walk there, use your eyes and ears to be able to consider all the things that you've learned in the desk-based research. And a walkover site is essential for doing that. There's only so much you can learn from 2D drawings or historic records. A walkover site primarily lets you do an examination of the site, looking at the slope or the shape of the ground, which is the topography, looking at any existing buildings, looking for evidence of wildlife, considering how much water there might be on the site, whether there's ponding or water running through the site, or and also services within the site. So are there any manholes or power lines or such? And if we consider these aspects, some of them may feature on maps, some of them may not, but a walkover site will give you first-hand experience of their condition and will give you clues as to how best to develop your own proposals. So the first item there, the topography. If we are looking at a site, we refer to the topography as the sort of shape of the land. It's if we broke it down into a three-dimensional mesh, we could see slopes, we could see banks, small valleys and such. So as you're walking around the site, you should be looking to see whether there are particularly steep sections, whether any of the topography has changed, whether there's any banks that have slid. So you'll see soil being exposed and lumps of topsoil with plants falling down. Are there evidence of changes over time or very dry pieces of ground? So it's worth just noting these things on. Whether you know what they are or not is not really important. You can note everything and then consider it later. But the walkover in terms of topography gives you that opportunity to take some notes, which you can then later consider against other evidence. If you have buildings on your site or next to your site, they can give you some valuable information about the condition of the ground. If there are buildings on the site and they show evidence of cracking or movement, then that will maybe tell you about how the ground underneath your feet is formed, what the subsoil may be, or what the bedrock may be. There's also, if there's evidence of existing buildings, this photograph's from James Watt Dock in Greenock, and this was an industrial site, and we can see on the photograph there's hard standing areas, there's probably evidence of buildings, so there may be material that needs to be removed from site, which has a cost attached to it. So noting these things down on a walkover survey is useful, and you can make choices about where your building goes based on your observations. Ecology of a site is increasingly important, and while you're walking over your site, you may directly notice animals, but more likely you're going to notice either nests or droppings, which can give you some indication as to what the wildlife is like on the site. It's worth getting a wildlife book or a plant book, just in case you decide to or just in case you look at the site and can see maybe rare evidence of rare animals or rare plants. If there are species that are protected by law, bats, some newts, quite a lot of plants are protected by law. it can be difficult to develop a site without giving mitigating measures. And mitigating measures would be to get a bat specialist to remove the bats to another location that you build, and that costs money. You pay for the bat surveyor, you pay for the movement, and you pay for the mitigation. So a client may not be keen on doing that, and if you haven't warned them at the start, then they might think it's your fault. So it's always better to note everything down just in case it comes back to haunt you later on. When you're walking over a site, it should be quite easy to establish whether there's any water, whether there's any standing water. And of course, you'd have to consider whether it has rained in the last while or immediately before your site visit. But if it hasn't and there's ground that's very wet or ponding, it can indicate that the soil is very poor at drainage, which in turn, if you were to put a building on there and ask for the soil to handle your surface water drainage or your foul water soak away, that can maybe indicate that it's not capable of doing that. It can also mean that there's maybe clay in the soil, which can complicate foundations. And if you do see water, it's worth noting it down and maybe suggesting to the engineer that trial pits need to be dug to establish what the soil is like. So it's a good indicator that there's maybe problems on the ground. Services can be one of the more obvious things that you see when you're walking over the site. A lot of times we have telephone wires or overhead power wires that are visible, or indeed in the ground there may be manholes or access chambers, or in some industrial sites like the James Watt dock that we saw on one of the previous slides, there would be train tracks for running for trolleys, and all these things would come under the term services. And they can be difficult to move, they can be difficult to reroute. Moving electrical cables requires the consent of the supplier and can be quite costly and sometimes needs an upgrade. So understanding where these things are has a cost implication for your client, but there's also a safety implication. Working in and around overhead services can be dangerous, especially if there's lifting equipment or high vehicles, or we're expecting scaffolding to be erected. So we have to think about where the services are when we're asking people to work around them. So once you've done your desk-based research and your walkover survey, we might establish from that your site has potential for development and may be considered feasible. So we need to get some hard information, some good data about the site to allow us to do the design properly. And that usually involves a topographic survey. So a topographic survey uses specialist equipment, usually done by a specialist surveyor, and it provides you with measured data on the heights of the various landscape features, the exact positions of landscape features, banks, fences, manholes, everything that's on the site can be measured. And this allows you to get a 2D or a 3D drawing to be able to develop up your design. And it's usually outputted to either be a 2D or a 3D file, which breaks the information down into most likely contour lines. So the image in the background here from the USGS is a contour line, and each contour line represents a level. So if we were to kind of walk along one of these contour lines, we could guarantee that it would be the same level all the way along relative to a datum, more likely sea level or a local datum. We can see on there that there's other things being noted. We can see a couple of tracks, benchmarks, there may be trees, and it also helps us understand the position of services, any other buildings on there. The topographic survey can be as detailed or as non-detailed as you like. So you can ask for the surveyor to consider a building in detail where he would actually start to give you levels of the ground floor, the eaves, the ridge, and all measurements in between. Or it can just be simply to locate things. But we would need, most designers would need a topographic survey of some description to be able to make decisions about how steep slopes are and where the best place to build would be. So in conclusion, if we're looking at our site investigation, desk-based and walkover, it allows a designer at an early stage to understand what the history of the site is, which might give clues as to whether there's contaminated land or uses that are maybe inappropriate for the potential development. It allows us to understand the shape of the ground. It can tell us about some of the limitations of the site, where we can build and where we can't build, potentials for wildlife to increase cost or disrupt the development. It can tell us whether there's services available. So not only if there's services on site which could be difficult to reroute, if there's services that are on site that are available for us to use. It can give us information on site safety. Where's the safest place to locate the site? Where's the safest place to work from or to store materials or to access with large machinery? And it can give us information on the implications of the cost of the site. So all of those items would come together to help a designer make decisions at an early stage and inform the start of the design work. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Following lectures will be placed on the Moodle page. If there's any questions about any of these lectures, you can ask me during the workshops. Okay, bye.